Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing well. So in this first video lecture, we are actually not going to be talking about the text Beowulf at all, a bit unorthodox, I know it may seem, but we're going to be talking about something called the Indo-Europeans or the Proto-Indo-Europeans, and what we've talked about already, something called the common ancestor or common inheritance model. So we're going to be exploring these two things today, and they will set up our larger discussion of Beowulf and how it relates to the Iliad and the Odyssey that we've just read and some of the texts that we're going to read in the future. Before we get started, though, let's return to our four methods for comparing ancient epic tales and just comparing things in general. So we've already gone over these a lot, but just to review, we can say X is like Y because 1, X causes Y via borrowing or influence. So we talked about how Homer's Odyssey might be borrowing from or be influenced by the Epic of Gilgamesh. Okay, also for instance, Nicki Minaj's Anaconda was influenced by or borrowed from Sir Mix-a-Lot's Baby Got Back. We could also say, and this is going to be the main subject of today's lecture, that X and Y come from the same source. So today we'll be talking about that source as the Indo-Europeans or the Proto-Indo-Europeans. But the general gist for this comparison is that you and your cousin both have red hair because you have the same genetics, right? So you have the same kind of origin way back in your family line. And let's see, number 3, polygenesis. The same circumstances give rise to both X and Y. So we were talking about this in terms of threatened masculinity. So we said that in certain situations where masculinity is threatened, then there will arise competitions about masculinity. So we read that article at the beginning of the class talking about Alcibiades and the speeches he gave to the Athenian assembly, and the article compared him to Trump. Okay. And lastly, we have coincidence, so X and Y can appear similar due to chance. This is always good to keep in mind. For instance, Persian bad is similar to English bad, but they are etymologically not related at all in any way. But who were these Indo-Europeans who allow us to talk about this shared heritage and this common ancestry between different texts? Well, they were a group of humans who lived sometime in the very distant past. Scholars are still kind of out on when the exact dates for these humans are, but we think that they lived somewhere between 4500 BCE and 7500 BCE. Right, so we're talking much, much older than Gilgamesh, much, much older than anything that we've talked about thus far. There's no archaeology to support their existence. We have no pottery or buildings, anything like that from the Proto-Indo-Europeans, like we have for Greeks, Romans, cultures from the Middle East, etc. Right? We also don't have any texts that they wrote, because this is before writing. All they have is oral storytelling, we can imagine. Right? So how do we know they existed? We know this mainly by reconstructing Indo-European language through the daughter languages. And these daughter languages are things like English, French, Italian, Latin, Greek, both ancient and modern languages that we think stem from a sort of parent language. Okay? And we also can recreate their kind of essence through Indo-European culture, literature, epics, certain things that we can trace back through the language itself. With these daughter languages, we can start constructing trees and working backwards toward a common ancestor through certain sounds in the language. So if you've heard of like the Romance languages that stem from Latin, we have French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, Catalan, some English when the French invaded England. So that's like one branch of this big Proto-Indo-European tree. Other branches are things like Celtic, from which we get Irish, Scottish, and Welsh. We also have the Hellenic branch, which is Greek, Indo-Iranian, Germanic, right, which is where we also get English and German and all that Northern European goodness. But this is a very simple tree. So we can create an even more complex tree, or some scholars can create an even more complex tree that looks something like this. And we can start breaking down all of these branches of the tree into very fine categories. Historical linguists sometimes spend their entire lives trying to reconstruct branches of this tree and figure out a lot of the details from which languages are related to which ones and how exactly we get from one language to another. And this is mainly done through something called the comparative method, which you can see here. The comparative method is essentially where you line up languages that you know are sort of related or seem very similar. So for instance, on the slide here, we have English, Latin, French, Italian, and Spanish. We know all of these are related in some way or another. And then you look at all of the individual sounds, and especially the consonant sounds, that look similar between each word. Okay, so here on the slide we have the numbers from 1 to 10, and you can easily see a lot of similar consonants between the different words for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so for instance, English one and Latin unus, French un, Italian uno, and Spanish uno all look very similar. They have an O or a U as the first vowel, followed by an N as a consonant, and then either nothing or an O or a U. So the important thing to know about these sound changes is that even though they happen differently for different languages, the sound changes that occur in each language stay the same throughout that language, right? So in moving from Latin unus to French un, that dropping off of the US ending stays the same across the board, okay? So you might also notice that in Latin, the Latin word for 5, quinque, we only get cinq, or C-I-N-Q in French. So we get the drop off of the UE. This kind of sound change stays exactly the same. And this kind of consistency is something that linguists call the regularity of sound change. This rule, the regularity of sound change, is very important for studying historical linguistics because it allows us to extrapolate information. And what I mean by that is that if we know Latin unus becomes un in French, then we might look at a different word in French and say, well, there might be something missing here at the end. Maybe there's a US missing. And if we add the US to the end of that French word, it might tell us what Latin word it comes from. Okay? And this also applies to other sounds as well. So you can imagine in a language, an R might turn into a T or something like that. And an R, then, no matter what word you choose, will always turn into a T in the daughter language. So for an additional example, the Latin EM is lost again at the end of certain words in French. So in Latin we have septem for 7, but in French we have sept, right? This is very close to the unus to un transition. But then we also have some weird sound changes that are almost unaccountable, right? So we have the Latin word octo for 8, and that becomes, in French, huit. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong because I don't know how to speak French. But as you can see, just from the text itself, there doesn't seem to be any similarities between those two words besides the T. Okay, so we have a very distinct, weird sound change that we really can't account for. Okay, and these are exceptions that sort of prove the rule, if you will, about regularity of sound change. Of course, sometimes you have very specific rules, right? So Latin qua will always become, in Italian, qua. There is no change there. However, qui in Latin becomes ci, ci in Italian. And we see both of these in numbers 4 and 5. So Latin 4 is quatuor, and in Italian that is quattro. In 5, quinque becomes cinque. Okay? So we know always qui in Latin will become ci in Italian, and that qua will remain the same between the two languages. And this is true no matter what words you're looking at in either language. So these sets of words from different languages that mean the same thing that we've been talking about are called a correspondence set. And so on this slide we have a correspondence set for the word father. Okay, so in English we have father, and then in the resulting in the rest of the list, we have different words for father from different languages. Okay, so in Gothic we have fadar, Latin pater, Greek pater, Sanskrit pitar, Avestran pitar, Old Persian pitta, Old Irish athir. Okay, and so when we're looking to reconstruct the PIE, the Proto-Indo-European root, or the Proto-Indo-European word for father, we're going to look at all of these words for father in the daughter languages and take a look at their consonants and see what we come up with. For consonant number 1, we have FF, PP, PPP, nothing. Okay, so if you take a second and think about which one we're going to select for our root, we're probably going to select the one that is most common. Okay, and so that would be P. Now, take a moment and think to yourselves what the second and the third consonant similarities might be. Okay, if you haven't had time, go ahead and pause the video, but you should have come up with something like this. So for the second consonant, we have th, d, t, 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 t. I think that was the right amount of t's. Kind of lost track. Third consonant, we have all r's except for Old Persian, which has nothing at the end. So if we're going to select consonants for our reconstruction from these two columns, we're probably going to pick T and R. And thus we get PTR, and we'll leave the filling in of the vowels to the historical linguists because vowels are very complicated. But the PIE root then for father is pater. And if you see that weird H2 sitting in between the P and the T, that's something really weird called a laryngeal, and we're not quite sure how they sound. They're these kind of reconstructed vowels that don't exist in the daughter languages. And our best guess for how they sounded is something really throaty and guttural, something like huh or buh. I know it's really disgusting, but that's our best guess for the laryngeals, so something like H2. So with that, let's move on to comb. Same deal as last time, try to reconstruct the PIE root, or at least the first and second consonants for the PIE root from this correspondence set I've shown. For the Greek, don't worry about the second bit there, k-on after kes. Just focus on kes for this. You should have come up with something that looks sort of like this. The first consonants, we have K, 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 C, and then for the second consonant we have D, S, 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 R. So if we take the most common sounds from all of those, all of the daughter languages, we come up with K as the first consonant and S as the second consonant, which gives us the PIE root kes. We can do this for lots of different words, but in the interest of time, I'm going to run through two quick additional correspondence sets and then show you some other words that are really common that we can derive Proto-Indo-European roots for. So English what or who, we can derive the PIE root quit or quo, and so this easily maps onto the Latin word quid. You might have heard this in the phrase like quid pro quo, something like that. But this is also related to the Old English word what, right, which is where we get what. And fun fact, that is the first word of Beowulf. So you can check out the correspondence set here. The word heart is a little bit more complicated. So in English we have heart, Latin cord, Greek cardia, so Latin and Greek look really similar. But in Sanskrit we have srada, in Avestan zrad, Hittite card, or an Old Irish krida. Okay, so you can see the correspondence set here. We get k or kya for the first consonant, r for the second, and d for the third. Okay, that first consonant's where it gets really iffy. But if we reconstruct a PIE root for heart, we get curd or cured. And here we have a list of I would say a representative sample of Proto-Indo-European roots. So we can reconstruct a word for grandson or nephew, the word for you, salt, seven, star, wheel, horse, axle, guest, and host. Okay, so the important thing to note about this list, since it is a representative sample, is what sorts of words we can reconstruct. So have a think about this set of words before you watch the next, much shorter video where we will talk about Proto-Indo-European culture and how we derive that from words such as comprise this list.